The Battle of Tassafaronga, sometimes referred to as the Fourth Battle of Savo Island or, in Japanese sources, as the Battle of Lunga Point, was a nighttime naval battle that took place on November 30, 1942, between United States Navy and Imperial Japanese Navy warships during the Guadalcanal campaign. The battle took place in Iron Bottom Sound near the Tassafaronga area on Guadalcanal. In the battle, a U.S. warship force of 5 cruisers and 4 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright attempted to surprise and destroy a Japanese warship force of 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka. Tanaka's warships were attempting to deliver food supplies to Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. Using radar, the U.S. warships gained surprise, opened fire, and sank one of the Japanese destroyers. Tanaka and the rest of his ships, however, reacted quickly and launched numerous Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes at the U.S. warships. The Japanese torpedoes hit and sank one U.S. cruiser and heavily damaged 3 others, enabling the rest of Tanaka's force to escape without significant additional damage but also without completing the intended supply delivery mission. Although a severe tactical defeat for the U.S., the battle had little strategic impact as the Japanese were unable to take advantage of the victory to further resupply or otherwise assist in their ultimately unsuccessful efforts to recapture Guadalcanal from Allied forces. Background: Guadalcanal campaign. On August 7, 1942, Allied forces landed on Guadalcanal, Lunga, and the Florida Islands in the Solomon Islands. The landings on the islands were meant to deny their use by the Japanese as bases for threatening the supply routes between the US and Australia, and to secure the islands as starting points for a campaign with the eventual goal of neutralizing the major Japanese base at Rabaul while also supporting the Allied New Guinea campaign. The landings initiated the 6-month-long Guadalcanal campaign. The 2,000–3,000 Japanese personnel present on the islands were taken by surprise, and by nightfall on August 8, the 11,000 Allied troops, under the command of Lieutenant General Alexander van der Grift, secured Tulungi and nearby small islands as well as the Japanese airfield under construction at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal. The Allies later renamed the airfield Henderson Field. Allied aircraft operating out of Henderson were called the Cactus Air Force, after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. To protect the airfield, the U.S. Marines established a perimeter defense around Lunga Point. Additional reinforcements over the next 2 months increased the number of U.S. troops at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal to more than 20,000. In response to the Allied landings on Guadalcanal, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters assigned the Imperial Japanese Army's 17th Army, a corps-sized command based at Rabaul and under the command of Lieutenant General Harukiichi Hyakutake, the task of retaking Guadalcanal. Units of the 17th Army began to arrive on Guadalcanal on August 19 to drive Allied forces from the island. Because of the threat by CAF aircraft based at Henderson Field, the Japanese were rarely able to use large, slow transport ships to deliver troops and supplies to the island. Instead, the Japanese used warships based at Rabaul and the Shortland Islands to carry their forces to Guadalcanal. The Japanese warships, mainly light cruisers and destroyers from the 8th Fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, were usually able to make the round trip down the slot to Guadalcanal and back in a single night, thereby minimizing their exposure to CAF air attack. Delivering the troops in this manner, however, prevented most of the soldiers' heavy equipment and supplies, such as heavy artillery, vehicles, and much food and ammunition, from being carried to Guadalcanal with them. These high-speed warship runs to Guadalcanal occurred throughout the campaign and were later called the Tokyo Express by Allied forces and RAT transportation by the Japanese. The Japanese attempted several times between August and November 1942 to recapture Henderson Field and drive Allied forces from Guadalcanal. to no avail. The last attempt by the Japanese to deliver significant additional forces to the island failed during the naval Battle of Guadalcanal of November 12, 15. On November 26, Japanese Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura took command of the newly formed 8th Area Army at Rabaul. The new command encompassed both Hyakutake's 17th Army in the Solomons and the 18th Army in New Guinea. One of Imamura's first priorities upon assuming command was the continuation of the attempts to retake Henderson Field and Guadalcanal. The Allied offensive at Buna in New Guinea, however, changed Imamura's priorities, because the Allied attempt to take Buna was considered a more severe threat to Rabaul. Imamura postponed further major reinforcement efforts to Guadalcanal to concentrate on the situation in New Guinea. Supply crisis due to a combination of the threat from CAF aircraft, U.S. Navy PT boats stationed at Tulungi, and a cycle of bright moonlight. The Japanese had switched to using submarines to deliver provisions to their forces on Guadalcanal. Beginning on November 16, 1942, and continuing for the next 3 weeks, 16 submarines made nocturnal deliveries of foodstuffs to the island, with one submarine making the trip each night. Each submarine could deliver 20 to 30 tons of supplies, about 1 day's worth of food, for the 17th Army. But the difficult task of transporting the supplies by hand through the jungle to the frontline units limited their value to sustain the Japanese troops on Guadalcanal. At the same time, the Japanese tried to establish a chain of 3 bases in the central Solomons to allow small boats to use them as staging sites for making supply deliveries to Guadalcanal. But damaging Allied airstrikes on the bases forced the abandonment of this plan. On November 26, the 17th Army notified Imamura that it faced a critical food crisis. Some frontline units had not been resupplied for 6 days, and even the rear area troops were on 1/3 rations. The situation forced the Japanese to return to using destroyers to deliver the necessary supplies. 8th Fleet personnel devised a plan to help reduce the exposure of destroyers delivering supplies to Guadalcanal. Large oil or gas drums were cleaned and filled with medical supplies and food, with enough airspace to provide buoyancy, and strung together with rope. When the destroyers arrived at Guadalcanal, they would make a sharp turn, the drums would be cut loose, and a swimmer or boat from shore could pick up the buoyed end of a rope and return it to the beach, where the soldiers could haul in the supplies. The 8th Fleet Guadalcanal Reinforcement Unit, based in the Shortland Islands and under the command of Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, was tasked by Mikawa with making the first of 5 scheduled runs using the drum method on the night of November 30. Tanaka's unit was centered around the 8 ships of Destroyer Squadron 2, with 6 destroyers assigned to carry from 200 to 240 drums of supplies apiece to Tassafaronga at Guadalcanal. Tanaka's flagship Naganami along with Takanami acted as escorts. The 6 drum-carrying destroyers were Kuroshio, Oyashio, Keijiro, Suzukaze, Kawakaze, and Makanami. To save weight, the drum-carrying destroyers left their reloads of Type 93 torpedoes at the Shortlands, leaving each ship with 8 torpedoes, 1 for each tube. After the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, U.S. Vice Admiral William Halsey, commander of Allied forces in the South Pacific, had reorganized U.S. naval forces under his command, including, on November 24, the formation of Task Force 67 at Espiritu Santo, comprising the heavy cruisers US Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton, the light cruiser Honolulu, and 4 destroyers. U.S. Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright replaced Thomas Kinkaid as commander of TF-67 on November 28. Upon taking command, Wright briefed his ship commanders on his plan for engaging the Japanese in future, expected night battles around Guadalcanal. The plan, which he had drafted with Kinkaid, stated that radar-equipped destroyers were to scout in front of the cruisers and deliver a surprise torpedo attack upon sighting Japanese warships, then vacate the area to give the cruisers a clear field of fire. The cruisers were then to engage with gunfire from 10,000 yards to 12,000 yards. The cruisers' float planes would scout and drop flares during the battle. On November 29, Allied intelligence personnel intercepted and decoded a Japanese message transmitted to the 17th Army on Guadalcanal alerting them to Tanaka's supply run. Informed of the message, Halsey ordered Wright to take TF-67 to intercept Tanaka off Guadalcanal. TF-67, with Wright flying his flag on Minneapolis, departed Espiritu Santo at 27 knots just before midnight on November 29 for the 580 miles run to Guadalcanal. En route, destroyers Lamson and Lardner, returning from a convoy escort assignment to Guadalcanal, were ordered to join up with TF-67. Lacking the time to brief the commanding officers of the joining destroyers of his battle plan, Wright assigned them a position behind the cruisers. At 1700 on November 30, Wright's cruisers launched one float plane each for Tulungi to drop flares during the expected battle that night. At 2000, Wright sent his crews to battle stations. Tanaka's force departed the Shortlands just after midnight on November 30 for the run to Guadalcanal. Tanaka attempted to evade Allied aerial reconnaissance aircraft by first heading northeast through Bougainville Strait before turning southeastern, then south to pass through Indispensable Strait. Paul Mason, an Australian coast watcher stationed in southern Bougainville, reported by radio the departure of Tanaka ships from Shortland, and this message was passed to Wright. At the same time, a Japanese search aircraft spotted an Allied convoy near Guadalcanal and communicated the sighting to Tanaka, who told his destroyer commanders to expect action that night and that, in such an event, utmost efforts will be made to destroy the enemy without regard for the unloading of supplies. Battle prelude at 2140 on November 30, Tanaka ships sighted Savo Island from Indispensable Strait. The Japanese ships were in line-ahead formation, interval 600 meters, in the order of Takanami, Oyashio, Kuroshio, Keijiro, Makinami, Naganami, Kawakaza, and Suzukaze. At this same time, TF-67 entered Lengo Channel en route to Iron Bottom Sound. Wright's ships were in column in the order Fletcher, Perkins, Maury, Drayton, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Honolulu, Northampton, Lamson, and Lardner. The four van destroyers led the cruisers by 4,000 yards and the cruisers steamed 1,000 yards apart. Takanami took station about 1 mile seaward to screen the column. At the same time, TF-67 exited Lengo Channel into the Sound and headed at 20 knots towards Savo Island. Wright's van destroyers moved to a position slightly inshore of the cruisers. The night sky was moonless with between 2 miles and 7 miles of visibility, because of extremely calm seas which created a suction effect on their pontoons. Wright's cruiser float planes were delayed in lifting off from Tulungi Harbor, and would not be a factor in the battle. At 23:06, Wright's force began to detect Tanaka ships on radar near Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal, about 23,000 yards away. Wright's destroyers rejoined the column as it continued to head towards Savo. At the same time, Tanaka ships, which were not equipped with radar, split into two groups and prepared to shove the drums overboard. Naganami, Kawakaza, and Suzukaze headed for their drop-off point near Doma Reef, while Makinami, Keijiro, Oyashio, and Kuroshio aimed for nearby Tassafaronga. At 23:12, Takanami's crew visually sighted Wright's column, quickly confirmed by lookouts on Tanaka's other ships. At 23:16, Tanaka ordered unloading preparations halted and all ships attack action. At 23:14, operators on Fletcher established firm radar contact with Takanami and the lead group of 4 drum-carrying destroyers. At 23:15, with the range 7,000 yards, Commander William M. Cole, commander of Wright's destroyer group and captain of Fletcher, radioed Wright for permission to fire torpedoes. Wright waited 2 minutes and then responded with, "Range on bogies, Tanaka ships on radar, excessive at present." Cole responded that the range was fine. Another 2 minutes passed before Wright responded with permission to fire. In the meantime, the U.S. destroyer's targets escaped from an optimum firing setup ahead to a marginal position passing a beam, giving the American torpedoes a long overtaking run near the limit of their range. At 23:20, Fletcher, Perkins, and Drayton fired a total of 20 Mark Chapter 15 torpedoes towards Tanaka ships. Maury, lacking SG radar and thus having no contacts, withheld fire. At the same time, Wright ordered his force to open fire. At 23:21, Minneapolis complied with her first salvo, quickly followed by the other American cruisers. Cole's Ford destroyers fired star shells to illuminate the targets as previously directed, then increased speed to clear the area for the cruisers to operate. Because of her closer proximity to Wright's column, Takanami was the target of most of the Americans' initial gunfire. Takanami returned fire and launched her full load of 8 torpedoes, but was quickly hit by American gunfire and, within 4 minutes, was set afire and incapacitated. As Takanami was destroyed, the rest of Tanaka ships, almost unnoticed by the Americans, were increasing speed, maneuvering, and preparing to respond to the American attack. All of the American torpedoes missed. Historian Russell S. Crenshaw, Jr. postulates that had the 24 Mark Chapter 15 torpedoes fired by U.S. Navy destroyers during the battle not been fatally flawed, the outcome of the battle might have been different. Tanaka's flagship, Naganami, reversed course to starboard, opened fire and began laying a smoke screen. The next 2 ships astern, Kawakaze and Suzukaze, reversed course to port. At 23:23, Suzukaze fired 8 torpedoes in the direction of the gun flashes from Wright's cruisers, followed by Naganami and Kawakaze, which fired their full loads of 8 torpedoes at 23:32 and 23:33 respectively. Meanwhile, the 4 destroyers at the head of the Japanese column maintained their heading down the Guadalcanal coast, allowing Wright's cruisers to pass on the opposite course. Once clear of Takanami at 23:28, Kuroshio fired 4 and Oyashio fired 8 torpedoes in the direction of Wright's column and then reversed course and increased speed. Wright's cruisers maintained the same course and speed as the 44 Japanese torpedoes headed in the direction. At 23:27, as Minneapolis fired her 9th salvo and Wright prepared to order a course change for his column, 2 torpedoes from either Suzukaze or Takanami slammed into her forward half. One warhead exploded the aviation fuel storage tanks forward of turret 1 and the other knocked out 3 of the ship's 4 firearms. The bow forward of turret 1 folded down at a 70-degree angle, and the ship lost power and steering control. 37 men were killed. Less than a minute later, a torpedo hit New Orleans abreast of turret 1 and exploded the ship's forward ammunition magazines and aviation gasoline storage. The blast severed the ship's entire bow forward of turret 2. The bow twisted to port, damaging the ship's hull as it was wrenched free by the ship's momentum, and sank immediately off the aft port quarter. Everyone in turrets 1 and 2 perished. New Orleans was forced into a reverse course to starboard and lost steering and communications. A total of 183 men were killed. Herbert Brown, a seaman in the ship's plotting room, described the scene after the torpedo hit. "I had to see. I walked alongside the silent turret 2 and was stopped by a lifeline stretched from the outboard port lifeline to the side of the turret. Thank God it was there, for one more step and I would have pitched head first into the dark water 30 feet below. The bow was gone. 125 feet of ship and number 1 main battery turret with 3 8-inch guns were gone. 1,800 tons of ship were gone. Oh my god, all those guys I went through boot camp with, all gone. Pensacola followed next astern in the cruiser column, observing Minneapolis and New Orleans taking hits and slowing. Pensacola steered to pass them on the port side and then, once passed, returned to the same base course. At 23:39, Pensacola took a torpedo abreast the mainmast. The explosion spread flaming oil throughout the interior and across the main deck of the ship, killing 125 of the ship's crew. The hit ripped away the port outer drive shaft and the ship took a 13-degree list and lost power, communications, and steering. Astern of Pensacola, Honolulu's captain chose to pass Minneapolis and New Orleans on the starboard side. At the same time, the ship increased speed to 30 knots, maneuvered radically, and successfully transited the battle area without taking any damage while maintaining main battery fire at the rapidly disappearing Japanese destroyers. The last cruiser in the American column, Northampton, followed Honolulu to pass the damaged cruisers ahead to starboard. Unlike Honolulu, Northampton did not increase speed or attempt any radical maneuvers. At 23:48, after returning to the base course, Northampton was hit by 2 of Kawakazi's torpedoes. One hit 10 feet below the waterline abreast the after engine room, and 4 seconds later, the second hit 40 feet further aft. The after engine room flooded, 3 of 4 shafts ceased turning, and the ship listed 10 degrees to port and caught fire. 50 men were killed. The last ships in Wright's column, Lamson and Lardner, failed to locate any targets and exited the battle area to the east after being mistakenly fired on by machine guns from New Orleans. Cole's 4 destroyers circled completely around Savo Island at maximum speed and re-entered the battle area, but the engagement had already ended. Meanwhile, at 23:44, Tanaka ordered his ships to break contact and retire from the battle area. As they proceeded up Guadalcanal's coast, Kuroshio and Kajiro fired 8 more torpedoes towards the American ships, which all missed. When Takanami failed to respond to radio calls, Tanaka directed Oyashio and Kuroshio to go to her assistance. The 2 destroyers located the burning ship at 100 on December 1 but abandoned rescue efforts after detecting American warships in the area. Oyashio and Kuroshio quickly departed the Sound to rejoin the rest of Tanaka's ships for the return journey to the Shortlands, which they reached 10 hours later. Takanami was the only Japanese warship hit by American gunfire and seriously damaged during the battle.